Aloha! We're here today with Dr. Kelli Nakamura of Kapiolani Community College. During World War II, authorities arrested and incarcerated Japanese in Hawaii due to racist fears. Many scholars skim over the details of the incarceration of residents of the neighbor islands, so like Hawaii Island, Kauai, Lanai, um, and focus on the larger narrative of Oahu incarceration, where authorities held Japanese at sites like Sand Island and Honouliuli, but not Dr. Kelli Nakamura. For years, she has been trying to expand the focus beyond Oahu to encompass the neighbor islands and rural areas as well. So, thank you for joining us today, Kelli, to talk about this research.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I think it honestly is an area of research that really still does need to be kind of developed, and there's a lot of room for many scholars to explore this important topic.
So, taking a step back, December 7th and the days that followed the attack on Pearl Harbor, can you talk to us? So, the FBI had a list that was already compiled of people of interest that were picked up immediately. Can you talk about the tiers and these lists that had already been compiled uh, on December 7th?
That's a great question. So, a lot of people think that internment was spontaneous or something that just automatically happened once Pearl Harbor was attacked. But actually, we do know that since the 1930s, the FBI, Honolulu Police Department, and other federal agencies had actually investigated so-called suspect Japanese and Japanese Americans. So I do want to kind of make a distinction that they were investigating not just Japanese aliens, Japanese nationals, but also essentially the second generation too. So we do see kind of this intense scrutiny by, in particular, the FBI investigating individuals, for example, like Buddhist priests, Shinto priests, Japanese language school teachers, prominent business people, usually businessmen, newspaper editors. These were all leaders of the community. And so already during the 1930s, you actually see FBI lists being compiled of essentially 1A and 1B. So 1A was essentially those who were to be immediately picked up in the event of a Japanese attack, which actually came to fruition in December 7th, 1941. So right after essentially the attack had occurred, you do hear stories about the people on 1A, this immediate pickup list, being apprehended by federal and essentially civil authorities. So we do see the collaboration or cooperation of the Honolulu Police Department. So it's this very interesting story that people were picked up either at their residence, their personal place, or their business. And in fact, because, for example, we do see police officers also having many personal relationships with these individuals, many of these individuals knew, for example, we do hear about an account of a Buddhist priest because he had actually given counseling to this particular policeman. The policeman knew to go to the back of the temple and knock on the resident's door rather than the temple itself, and say, you actually do need to come with us. And of
I
course,
think
the
probably one of the, sorry to interrupt, but one of the best accounts to read is Soga's book. Yes, he was the editor of the Nippon Jiji. So I think Japanese Cultural Center translated his diaries or his journals and put it together in a book, and you really get details of what happened when he was picked up and taken to Sand Island, and just the what he was feeling at the time. Yeah.
So, one of the best things that I encourage everyone to do is actually read some of these internee accounts, people who were arrested, as you mentioned. The Japanese Culture Center had published a series of 3 volumes, the first one being the newspaper editor's Yasutaro Soga. And a lot of residents, even still today, not only details his accounts, because he was a newspaper editor, he kept incredibly detailed records of the people that he met, the places that he went to. And in fact, in the back, you do see actually an index of all the people that he encountered. The ships, in fact, they were actually sent to the incarceration centers on the mainland. So it's not just a personal account, it really is a community account of what actually occurred during this time.
And how did these pickups and the list differ on the neighbor islands, so outside of Oahu?
So we also do see both immediately after the attack, in days, weeks, and in fact even months after the Pearl Harbor attack, the same thing would actually occur on the neighbor islands. But what was kind of interesting or unusual is that many people don't realize that statewide, in Hawaii, we actually have 17 identified incarceration sites thus far. So a lot of people think, as you mentioned, of course, we do see stories that come out from Sand Island and Honouliuli. We also know, for example, on Oahu, the Yokohama Species Bank, which is in downtown, which is still existing, it's a historical building, was also used to house other individuals. But that leaves essentially almost 14 different sites that we do really need to account for. And so when you think about the majority of the incarceration or the internment experience or the internment sites, you really should look at the neighbor islands.
But I think you were saying that some of the people were put on lists by plantation managers, and some were not picked up because the plantation manager intervened.
That's absolutely
This was happening on the neighbor island, so very personal.
right. So if you look at actually a map of the incarceration sites, for example, I love to look at Kauai. Um, we can see actually, you look at where the incarceration sites were on Kauai, it's all located, and here's the map right now, right next to major plantation cities or plantation towns or plantation areas. For example, like Lihue, Kapa'a, and other areas, Waimea, Kalaheo. Most people know them as, yes, Kauai cities or Kauai towns, excuse me, but it's because they had plantations there. And so you see the kind of location of the incarceration centers right next to these Japanese communities. So again, here you have Oahu. They do have kind of identified sites itself. Maui, Lanai, Maui, even on the Big Island. So most major of the islands did in fact have incarceration sites. We do see people who were in fact incarcerated on Ni'ihau and they were brought to Kauai. So not to exclude Ni'ihau, but because of the proximity, they were actually incarcerated there.
So for people who might not know, Ni'ihau is a privately owned island. It's owned by the Robinson family. Not just anyone can go there. You have to have an
Absolutely.
invitation.
Absolutely. So, going back to your question, you're absolutely correct when talking about, your relationship with the plantation. Management or officials in your role would actually potentially impact your incarceration. So we do hear stories about individuals who said, "Yeah, I was never incarcerated. What are you talking about?" Um, for example, I did research on Mitsunio Totori, who was a Buddhist priest, who was still actually one of the few to be able to operate. Um, and the plantation managers knew about his activities and experience, and we know this because they gave him extra rations of gas during war when gas was actually rationed to continue to conduct services across the island. Versus another experience, which I hear on Lanai, where you read the incarceration experience and the FBI accounts, they're interviewing the plantation managers, and the plantation managers are saying, this person is particularly suspect, they should be immediately apprehended. So it could go both ways. It's not a uniform experience, and that's what makes it so fascinating.
So Dr. Andrew Wertheimer is asking, did you find that information from Freedom of Information requests, or what kind of records are you getting
That's
information?
So, I always encourage people who are looking for internment experiences and internment personal family accounts to do two things. Number one, you can definitely file a Freedom of Information Act. That is what FOIA is for people who may not be familiar with. It's going to ask you to provide as many details as possible. And of course, it's going to take a couple weeks, couple days. I have yet to hear from some of them for months on end now. And usually, honestly, there's not too much on them. But for example, with the Totori family, I was able to actually find a great deal because his father was actually not incarcerated. So he didn't have a record. The second option that I would encourage people to do, which is to contact NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, particularly in College Park, Maryland. So, it's this weird thing of, where do you like to go traveling? College Park, Maryland. It's amazing. And people are like, Maryland? And I said, yes. So what people should actually do is stay in DC, and there's a staff there's a staff shuttle that goes from the National Archives in DC. You can take it for free, and it drives you all the way to Maryland. So you don't have to take a bus. It drops you off, and you essentially can file and search for your individuals. So I encourage.
I've been there. It's like being in a candy store, isn't it?
It is. It's so neat. And, I was lucky enough to go to it when I had one of the senior archivists who was helping me. And if you ever remember Indiana Jones in the Last Ark, he says, "Hey, do you want to go in the back?" And I said, "Yes, I do. I want to see it." And it's everything you imagine. It's like, oh my God. But I've been looking through these files. Sometimes you will see absolutely nothing. So I don't want people to think that because your great grandfather or great grand uncle was incarcerated, they're going to have a record. Sometimes you see nothing. Sometimes you see wallets. I've seen wallets, pocket watches, personal photographs, money that was on these individuals when they were actually incarcerated.
And you actually had contact with the Totori family, who opened up all of their personal papers and records to you, which was actually a great avenue for you, right?
It,
Into
it's this
finding more
wonderful
information.
it's this wonderful thing of here in Hawaii we often have just a few degrees of separation, not 6 degrees of
Yes.
separation. You say, hey, I'm looking them up people, and older individuals still do have their phone number and address published in the white pages. It's
Yes.
insane. And you can literally call cold call people sometimes, email them, write to them, not email them, and say, hey, this is what I'm looking for, this is what I'm investigating. So I had heard from Ted Tsukiyama, which is an MIS veteran who lives in Manoa, who knows the Totoris, who had this connection. It's this one kind of brief connection after the next. So here in
Yeah.
Hawaii, you literally can almost find almost anyone.
I do want to emphasize that, there were the tiers that the
Yes.
FBI was picking up people on December 7th and through, the days following. But Hawaii did not see the kind of mass removal that you saw on the mainland of the United States. And, a really good documentary to watch if you were interested to learn why uh, Executive Order 9066 was not utilized in Hawaii is Tom Kaufman's documentary. What was it? First Battle,
Hmm.
which I think you can find in libraries, yeah? But it
Absolutely.
takes a look at what happened behind the scenes that kept the hysteria from running rampant. But that doesn't mean people were not taken away. And, you were saying before to me that Oahu, people were taken to a number of locations. And I was struck by your statement. They did and did not have a plan at the
Yes.
time. Can you tell me about that? Like, how prepared were they for suddenly picking up these people on the list and incarcerating them?
I think the best examples I look at is the neighbor islands of Kauai, Lanai, Molokai, and Maui in particular, because what you see here in Hawaii is that essentially civil facilities like jails, um, Japanese language schools, for example, in Hilo, were actually used as incarceration or gathering centers for these so-called suspect individuals. So when you really think about the preparedness, yes, we did have military facilities that were available. For example, on Oahu, the immigration center, which was already kind of under federal control. Later, of course, Sand Island and Honouliuli. On essentially the Big Island, we do see is Kilauea Military Center, KMC, being utilized for that particular purpose. But on other places, for example, on Molokai, you have Kaunakakai Jail, which is in Malama Park right now. And you have other places, for example, like Lanai, where you have Lanai Jail, um, where if you go to Lanai, even still today, it's part of the history, but something that I think even Hawaii residents aren't familiar with, because
Yeah.
many Hawaii residents, as we've also talked about, we don't often visit the smaller neighbor islands, for example, like Molokai, besides maybe going on the mule rides, which, by the way, again, is great. It's fantastic. But, to say, I want to look for these incarceration centers or incarceration sites, and on Molokai, for example, um, you see them in a state of deterioration. For example, uh, in Malama Park, where it's dilapidated, kind of, I'd be happy to share photos of essentially it being literally falling apart, weeds growing over it, versus something that is more well preserved, but pretty much I think really not well known beyond the Lanai community. For example, Lanai Jail.
So
You
on
go
the
to
neighbor islands, these are civil facilities, not
Yeah,
military.
absolutely. These are civil facilities that were located within the communities themselves. So, for example, Lanai Jail is in Dole Park, which is the center of Lanai City. So, if you go there, of course, you'll have to take a plane usually from Oahu or Maui. And You'll have to essentially rent a car, and that's not very feasible because it's either you stay at the Four Seasons or something, this luxury resort, or you hire local Uber, which is Rabical's limo service, which is also an excellent service. And basically, locals just come and pick you up in their car, and they drop you off in the middle of the town. And it's a rectangle along Dole Park with beautiful trees, surrounding it, and you can pretty much see it um, essentially on the corner right across Lanai Jail, right across from the Japanese language school, the Christian school, the local grocery stores, and things like that.
So,
And
if we jump to talk about that visit, this is something you did on your own time and your own dime
yes,
because you how important is it for people to visit the actual site and and see where these facilities are located?
I think it's worth people's time. I mean, it shouldn't be kind of a tourist attraction, but just to kind of see the experience of viscerally what it is to actually experience incarceration, and not in kind of a um, I don't want to say, I want to make it, of course, a meaningful experience, that you're not just doing it just to put something on Instagram or popular media, but just to really experience what these individuals went through over 50 years ago. Um, I don't know if you want to show a clip, if
Oh,
or
the
wait
video
to
of the
yeah.
the jail that you encountered on Lanai.
So if you want to give the audience some insight of what it is to actually see and visit and be in one of these incarceration centers, clearly I had a lot of time on Lanai, and I just made a very short video of actually entering and experiencing one of these incarceration centers. Okay, and I do apologize in advance for the roller coaster that this is completely amateur, photography at this time, but just to kind of give people experience of
Well,
it's
I
basically the
mean,
size of
the
a
thing
shipping
you have to
container.
think about is that is where
Hmm.
they were placed. They
Yes.
were taken from their homes abruptly with no warning, no chance to really say goodbye or pack items. They didn't know where they were going, and they were put in that looks like a shed, doesn't it?
It's like a shipping container. It's the size of a shipping container. So that's why literally I could just walk around it. And there's two holding facilities. As mentioned, the indoor plumbing was a relatively new addition, so I don't want people to think that that is contemporaneous to that particular time. But I do believe the pallet or the bunk was. But you can just see the size, and what really kind of struck me was, as we talked about, the windows. I mean, we're talking about very little ventilation, and luckily Lanai City is a little bit of a higher elevation, so it is a little bit cooler. Um, but it's not easy to actually see these individuals, for them to actually stay there. Um, I didn't want to actually shut the door on myself because I was deeply concerned that I could eventually be locked in. But you could see pretty much how dark it actually could be very easily, come around, mid afternoon on. So when we're really thinking about incarceration, these are local small facilities that really weren't built or
Well, and I
used.
saw a light bulb at the top, a light at the top,
Mhm.
but at that time, I'm guessing they didn't have the luxury of lights,
Correct.
especially during martial law. But
Hmm.
and we're also guessing that there was no toilet and sink and running water
Hmm.
at that time.
Correct.
But
So
what struck me was how you ended the video, which was that sign that said prisoners should not be in there longer than 2 hours. How long, like what was the typical time and what was the longest probably amount of time that prisoners were incarcerated there?
So this is where we're looking at, the numbers of people were actually who are incarcerated, and so I'm just looking at the chat and some of the questions. We're really trying to identify still today the individuals who were incarcerated at Lanai and Molokai in particular, because the numbers kind of shift from maybe a couple dozen or just a handful from Lanai. Honestly, to identify, you know, we think about anywhere from a dozen on. Um, but how we're actually going about doing this is very interesting research. So let me go to your first question and elaborate on how we're finding out on these individuals.
But backing
Um,
up a bit, so how long were they in that shed?
so
Was
some
it
people have
weeks?
estimated sometimes days, sometimes weeks before they were eventually shipped off, to Maui. So if you even still today, as I mentioned, to go to Lanai, there's pretty much two major islands where you have regular service. Um, they were shipped to essentially Maui, then to Oahu, and either to Honouliuli, and there to essentially mainland incarceration centers. Um, so, how we're actually trying to recover these stories from Lanai and Molokai, for example, on Molokai. I literally had a connection, thankfully, with a local family who was the only pharmacist in town, and to kind of identify people from Molokai. Um, I had to get in contact with a local ornithologist, yes, a bird scientist. And, I said, well, how do you track information in the community? She says, well, there's literally a bulletin board, and that you just post something on a 3x5 index card, and you ask people in the community, have you seen the birds? Do you know anything about incarceration? And what the purpose of this information is for? And that, she says, that's how I realized, this Hawaiian stilt that we were tracking goes back and forth. And I said, are you for real? And so that's how I literally am doing research, because you may have names, but you're wondering if these families are still there or if they actually moved. So, for example, I know a number of families, from Lanai, who actually moved as a result of incarceration. So, because they were essentially, I'm just thinking about one gentleman in particular. He was incarcerated, so his children were already attending the University of Hawaii, UH. He and his wife, his wife later joined him, and they just resettled back on Oahu. So trying to track the movements of people, um, is something that we're still kind of struggling with. We know where they were from, but where they eventually ended up, that's another question.
Dr. Drew asked about Kibe. Like, have you found out more about Kibe who were detained? Did they make a lot of distinction in So kibe, for those who might not know, are people who were born in Hawaii or the U.S. but went back to Japan to get their education, and then came back. Are they distinguished, or are they categorized that way? Do we
They
track
are, in
them?
fact. So you do actually see, statistics for essentially the military, and particularly for the pickup list, if they were Kibe or not. As we also were talking about in our other topic, we also have even the military distinguishing with Japanese Americans or Japanese and Okinawan Americans. So it's very interesting when you see, and that's why you have to read more than one report, I feel, because you see how they categorize or distinguish or identify people. It could change. Um, you do see the Kibe status versus, Nisei status versus even Okinawan Americans. So, um,
But
I,
despite that, I've read multiple accounts where they picked up the wrong person
oh
with the
yeah,
same name. They just went to the wrong so and so, right? And then took them, detained them, and then discovered, oh, we got the wrong one. And so the first one got released, they went after the other one. And so I've been told that the records are not that great
right. I
because
mean,
they're not really noting, oh, we picked up the wrong so and so, this person. So they got let loose, and yeah.
I think even Soga mentions the Miyao family, who's basically the daughter-in-law, got picked up instead of the mother-in-law. So, this is where, well, that is my name, Mrs. Miyao, but um, it's the wrong person that you're actually thinking about. You're not thinking about essentially the second generation, you're thinking about the first generation. So you do also have cases of mistaken identity. We do also
So
see some
women were incarcerated. I feel like
women.
we assume that majority of those picked up were men. So were a lot of women incarcerated and picked up?
They comprise a minority, and that is something I think, honestly, we still need to have investigation with. The experiences of women and those who, for example, were not picked up. So we also believe that besides Totori, there was a Buddhist priest, I think maybe even a Shinto priest, a female who was not incarcerated on Maui, was allowed to continue to practice. And people think, number one, it was because she was female, and number two, she also had a physical disability. So the authorities didn't think she was that dangerous. So it seems very arbitrary on who was and who was not actually incarcerated during this time.
And because you mentioned the Meow family, is that the family where kids under 10 years old were left alone because both parents were taken away?
Absolutely. I mean, this is where, clearly, of course, the, internees themselves have passed away. So we're talking about the experiences of their children who are now in their 60s, 70s, to be perfectly honest, who've experienced this. And I still remember doing an interview with Densho, and it was about this gentleman who's, in his 70s at this time, and he was crying about the fact, um, because he came from a very prominent doctor's family. His parents were incarcerated, and what really kind of affected him about the incarceration experience, he talks about the fact that our family was left alone, and my sister, who was a more of a delicate individual, um, she later committed suicide. And he said, that's what I remember about the war. We didn't have parents, we didn't have family, and I think it more deeply affected other individuals um, than we'd like to actually admit. So here's this gentleman who's in his 70s, still thinking about his beautiful sister, who he considers to be a casualty of this war, because they were without parents, they were without support during a time which actually, you most needed it.
And I can't imagine parents taken away, kids left alone, if they
Mhm.
didn't have support of other family or neighbors. What happens. And I'm thinking, do you know, for those who were taken away, was there a stigma attached to the family left behind?
And this is where it's another kind of story that I think also needs to be examined. The sentiment of shame within the Japanese community about being distinguished for something that may not be as desirable. And so there was, a great deal of shame and embarrassment with some individuals who were incarcerated because formerly they did occupy a very prominent position in the Japanese community. And now when they returned, essentially their businesses, their homes, even their temples were in fact confiscated or destroyed or co-opted by essentially military officials during this time. So you also see, even still today, kind of this residual. Why didn't my great grandparents or grandparents ever talk about this? And there's in part maybe could be personal shame associated with that.
So, can I ask you, what is the status of research on incarceration sites on the neighbor islands?
So I'm doing it right now, of course, looking at essentially the sites themselves. There's actually efforts for preservation, particularly on Molokai, and I'll be happy to later share photographs from Kanukakai jail. If you actually Google it, it's in terrible shape. And so, there's not much of a push or impetus to preserve these sites because a lot of people don't know about the significance of these sites. So really, it's something that I think is deserving of um, further research. However, I'm just going to put as a caveat for people who are like, oh my gosh, this is my new research topic. You really have to be respectful and in tune with the community, especially on small neighbor islands, for example, like Molokai and Lanai, where, um, for example, when I was doing research on Lanai and I was doing all of this reconnaissance and photographing Lanai jail, and I later called up the limo service. Basically, a guy picked me up in his truck to pick me up. They're like, "Oh yeah, we know who you are. You're that girl who's walking around." So the residents were clearly watching and seeing, and they're like, "What is this one doing here?" She's not a Japanese tourist, and she's not a mainland tourist, and she's just interested in this structure that always does exist. So we want to be respectful of the locals and essentially the personal ties, and be very honest. As if I am with my research, you say, this is out of my own personal pocket here. It is not for monetary, but more academic purposes in which I'm doing this, just to kind of understand the experiences of neighbor island communities. My dad's side, for example, is from Kapa'a Kauai. He was my grandfather was born and raised on the Hui plantation. So so there's also kind of a personal tie to understand how certain individuals benefited from World War II with military service, of course, a great sacrifice, and how others were, of course, stigmatized because of their experiences. Um, yeah.
I think one thing I'm trying to get a understanding of is, so you as a historian have combed through the National Archives. You've gone through a lot of the documentation and records, and as you mentioned, it's like a treasure hunt in some degree, but you don't always find a lot of information.
Mhm.
So does that mean your focus now is on memoirs, memories, and getting information from the community and the public?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the real challenge when talking about. So, for example, to get uh, a photograph of what actually, for example, Kanukakai jail looked like in Molokai. I was very lucky enough that I talked to the Mikami family, and they were the ones that had a pharmacy, and they were the only ones with a camera, and they were photographing Armistice Day, which is essentially now Veterans Day, essentially the end of World War One. So they're photographing. The father was photographing essentially the parade, but in the background there is the picture of what the jail originally looked like.
I saw
So these
that photo. It's
right,
actually a very clear and sharp photo.
right, but the purpose wasn't we're going to photograph the jail. It was the parade in front of the jail. But so that's where in talking with that fantastic Arlene Dibion, um, ornithologist who was doing all this study, she says what you need to do is ask people to just look at their family albums, and that's again a personal connection, and you're not looking for them the people, you're looking for what's in the background. um, and so this is the challenge with, so going to that question of is there an effort by the Park Service to memorialize this. There's effort by the local community, but it really takes money and effort and documentation, and that's something, especially with our federal budget right now, is not high on the prioritization, to be perfectly honest, especially with what is going on. Although we are reassured by the fact that, for example, Honouliuli and other places have been designated national parks um, to
I guess
memorialize
that
that.
is a question. You said there were 16 sites
17.
in 17 sites in Hawaii. Um, then within that, so obviously Honouliuli has been designated.
Mhm.
Um, what about the remaining 16, right?
I mean, that's the real question. I mean, there are various states. To be perfectly honest, Kaunakakai Jail is in disrepair. And there's two structures that you should look for in Malama Park. Somewhere like, for example, Lihue Jail is in great shape. Um, Something like the Immigration Center is also. But if you go to other neighbor islands, for example, like Hawaii, we're still trying to find Loke Kalaheo Stockade. We have old pictures of essentially what the jail facility looked like. It was actually demolished. We're still looking for another site there. Maui, also, I mean, literally, it's been built over at this time. So we're asking the residents to say if you have any photographs of these older facilities, that's what we're actually looking for. But don't look for pictures of the facilities. It's usually your relatives or family members celebrating a certain event there, and you have
You're
to look in
looking
the
in the
background.
background to see if it might pop up.
Right.
But, so, okay, like the Lanai location,
Mhm.
um, if at most people were kept there for, say, 3 weeks before being shifted over to the Maui location and then eventually to Honouliuli or a location on the mainland of the US, the length of time that it served as an incarceration site is very short in comparison, say, to, like the DOJ camps, the internment camps on the
Correct.
mainland, Honouliuli. So if it was almost like a transition location, how important is it to preserve and keep that kind of thing, given that it is short in comparison?
Well, so this is what I kind of focus on. If you look at Hawaii incarceration accounts, it's a personal story. For example, like Yasutaro Soga, it talks about his experiences going from one camp to the next. It doesn't give kind of a holistic experience of each individual camp, but more importantly, how these facilities or how these Japanese communities were impacted by incarceration. So a lot of people look at Hawaii incarceration, to be perfectly honest, as an experience that is Oahu centric, and it was all for the purpose of mobilizing the war, securing for national security purposes, certain vulnerable locations and sites like that. I look at more of a community history. How did incarceration and these incarceration sites impact the remaining community and the community itself? So, for example, in Lanai Jail, it's part of an overall war history that I really think needs to be explored. So Lanai was pineapple. And in fact, still today, there's a lot of pineapple growing on. Um, but if you look at the jail, it's kitty corner right across from the Christian church and the Buddhist temple, where, according to local folklore, once December 7th happened, they had the Buddhist temple, and in there was a Buddhist bell that mysteriously overnight disappeared. And no one knew what happened to it. And that Buddhist temple was eventually taken over by military officials and later transferred and became a Christian church. No one knew what happened to the bell. Then, as soon as World War II ended, the bell reappeared. So, wait,
So
what? It
someone in the community took the bell to protect
took
it.
the bell to protect it, knowing that, like, likely, as in other Buddhist temples, although it would later, of course, be accurate, they would be essentially scavenged for supplies or anything that might be valuable or interesting by military officials, and then suddenly it reappeared. So when you're talking about,
Wow.
the history of Lanai Jail, it's talking about how close knit this community was, what kind of Japanese communities actually existed. A lot of people, of course, look at the American South and the experiences of African Americans and the plantation experience. And I said, well, we really do need to tie in Hawaii's plantation experience to the war experience, and how deeply embedded and ingrained the plantation economy was to these communities. Again, look at where they're located, especially on the neighbor islands. They're right next to large Japanese communities, large Japanese camps, right next to essentially the plantations themselves.
And
So,
I have to say, the video that you took of the Lanai, where they were locked up on Lanai, kind of gives you just a tiny glimpse of what they went through, which we wouldn't have if the site was no longer standing. Yeah.
and I just shot this video just for my own personal kind of, just to remind myself honestly what it was to kind of experience and see it. Something that doesn't necessarily is conveyed when you simply have photographs, to kind of understand the place of that site in the community and the experience of actually viscerally being in, honestly, a shipping container, which was halved, to be perfectly honest, and to see how, if you're claustrophobic, that would probably give you just chills right there. Um, Not only how embarrassing it is to be incarcerated right in the middle of town, where you were clearly visible to everyone, but how yet though shut off you were from the rest of the community, how isolated you were. Um,
And
and
just
you're
based on what Soga wrote about his experiences, that, he didn't take a change of clothes. He just wore what he had on. I think his wife gave him some extra handkerchiefs. But
Mhm.
after that, they had no idea where he was. So, they couldn't take him anything. So he's only in what he's wearing. And, you're saying people were there for weeks without anyone being able to get to them, right?
With
Or
changing
or to do.
clothes, or with being able to essentially have toothbrushes, or just be able to shave regularly or get a haircut. I mean, we've all gone through this whole um, pandemic, and we've had shutdowns and things like that, and we have experienced, at least viscerally, some kind of understanding of the isolation, of essentially separation from the larger community, of just being locked into one place. Yes, I'm not saying that these are parallel experiences, but just to kind of understand, well, you're stuck and there's nothing to do. And, here I am. And as a breadwinner, I think that really weighs heavily on the mind of people, especially when you're gone for 4+ years, to be perfectly honest. Um, these are very traditional times. So I would also like to kind of really understand the experiences of the families left behind. The women in particular, who are now faced with raising children, potentially running businesses. Um, we also hear stories. I just do remember a particular incident from this pineapple family in Lanai, who says, "Yeah, my mother, she had the worst time getting groceries. The butcher would just give her such a hard time, and my mother never forgot about that." And she says she thinks it's because of the war and because our father was interned or incarcerated. She never patronized that business ever again. Um, so, to understand the anger and frustration and challenges that I think the women also experience, a lot of people look at the internment experience as male centric, which it is, the majority were males. Um, Here in Hawaii, though, I want to talk about the resiliency of the women and the families who were left behind.
And I think it strikes me that this is what makes the Hawaii incarceration story so different, is that there wasn't a mass removal. So you have a very different experience with people left behind.
Yeah,
Like you're saying, family in a family. If the father is taken away and they're the breadwinner, the mother is left behind to hold everything together. Maybe some of the kids would have to go to work, but all the places of, so like the Buddhist temples are all shut down except for Jiko and Honganji in Honolulu. So they didn't have a place for solace, support, and gathering. So it is a completely different experience, given that only some or a lot of our leaders were taken away.
right. I mean, it's not to diminish the experiences of those who were incarcerated on the mainland. I said it was very different and it impacted families in very different ways. To be kind of the focus of public shame and honestly then separation, people don't want anything to do with you, and because Hawaii is so close knit, everyone knows what's going on, everyone knows what's happening, everyone knows if your family got arrested and you're trying to make ends meet. So I see in the chat from Dr. Andrew, are there any markers? None. um, you can email me. We can have a Zoom session. I can show you pictures of how terrible Kanakakai jail is, to visit at Malama Park. It is literally surrounded by barbed wire. They're trying to prevent people because it's falling apart. It is in absolute disrepair. If you ever go there, you should wear shoes because there are beer bottles, drug paraphernalia. It's a dump. I mean, it's literally a dump where they're dumping things. And these structures are slowly degrading. So, of course, at places like KMC or Honouliuli, you see efforts by the National Park Service to preserve it. Maui, no, we don't really see that. Hawaii, we're still trying to locate them. And the other neighbor islands, definitely not.
So with those, is it going to be up to each individual community where that um, incarceration site is located to kind of, whether it's to preserve or to market in some way?
To market and to kind of share the stories. I'm particularly I'm looking at Molokai and how many people were actually incarcerated there. I need stories from the community themselves to confirm that these were the individuals who were in fact incarcerated. Um, that is something that we want to respect, of course, the community and their family experiences in particular, and the purpose behind this. My bread and butter is paid by the University of Hawaii, so clearly there's no financial benefit for me. But just to kind of understand that, we look at the mainland incarceration centers, and there's rightfully effort to preserve them. Um, we've numbered that. I mean, in Hawaii, we really um, have a comparable kind of numbers as far as facilities that really kind of belly reveal how so-called dangerous Japanese Americans were considered to be by military and civil officials.
So Dr. Drew has another question. He's asking, do the communities have interest in some signage or recognition, or is this tied to trauma still?
I think it honestly is that many people don't know about it, and it's been literally over 50 years since that process. Families have moved away. We do talk about a lot of families. So, for example, in my chapter on Maui, Maui was one of the most militarized. It really saw a dramatic shift in the Japanese communities that exist right now. So, if you go to Maui, so today, once was the site of the largest um, sugar plantation in the world, which is Pu'unene. And you're talking about the incredible Japanese communities that exist there. They do exist, but not to the size, scope, and scale. We do see a lot of movement with local residents. We do see them moving to the mainland and also to Oahu for better jobs and opportunities. My family in particular, we're from Kauai. My dad's side, we moved from Kapa'a, in part because my grandfather got an army job during the war. And so, that kind of experience is also not unusual. When you have that upward mobility through military service, um, you know, the inspiration we joke in my family, but not for us to all go to college is because my grandfather said, you are not going to work on the plantations. We're only two generations removed from the plantation. So it's not something that occurred in the past. It's, well, why can't my parents help me out in college? Well, because they struggled during college because their parents, for example, my dad's parents, primarily spoke Japanese or had a sixth grade education. It's all because they were working on the plantations. So really to kind of see the next progression, we moved out from Hawaii um, because of the war in part for better opportunities. And still right now we see that issue with the neighbor islands where there's two major industries, or maybe three: tourism, militarism, and the hotel, like tourism, the state, and militarism, right? Those are the major industries there even still today.
I think though it's striking that you say there were 17 incarceration sites on all of the islands of Hawaii, and I think if you talk to most people, they would only know two:
Mhm.
Honouliuli and Sand Island. And so I don't know if you could provide a listing of the 17. I know that the locations are no longer known, but that something was there, like on
Yeah.
Maui or.
So, for example, we are particularly looking for any evidence of Kalaheo stockade. So I'm going to kind of give a personal shout out on certain sites in particular that we really don't know much about. Um, Haiku jail also is something that we really need more information about. We're looking both at the state and local level. We would really kind of benefit, to be perfectly honest, about more information for the Hilo Japanese Language School, in which some individuals were actually taken. We do know there's a book that was written from, I think, the daughter of one of these organizers. So, again, here's a map, but I really want to kind of give a shout out and personal um, plug for if you know anything about the Kalaheo Stockade, Molokai. We're still looking for more individuals who are going to come forth to talk about their experiences. We really don't have a lot about what actually they experience. Haiku camp in Maui is also something that we really need more of, and the Hilo Japanese language school, and Waiakea prison.
So, to round it out, what are some resources that people who want to learn about internment in Hawaii can look at? We mentioned Tom Kaufman's documentary First Battle as a way to understand why there wasn't mass removal in Hawaii. But what other resources? There's the Soga book, the 3 books you mentioned that Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii published. Any other resources that people can take a look at if they want to learn more about this topic?
Absolutely. If you're just having a general interest about this topic and don't want to just go to Wikipedia, please check out the Japanese Culture Center site under resources, and we can send that out to you folks. They have a really nice kind of overview of the incarceration experiences and resources. The other source, if you wanted to do something a little bit more academic, because we do have students here who are researching this topic, if you go to Hamilton Library under
So
Library
this
Guide,
is University of Hawaii's main
University
library.
of Hawaii, Hamilton Library, under Library Guides, a wonderful librarian by the name of Jody Matos has put together a library guide of pretty much all the resources that are accessible for you, often digitized, about the Hawaii experience. And you can kind of comb through that and look through that if you are searching for a more academic bent. If you're looking for personal family history, as I mentioned, there's 2 things you can do: file a Freedom of Information Act with the FBI, or number 2, contact the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. So there's different kind of levels of what you're actually interested in. And of course, I'm just doing a lot of scholarship myself, so feel free to contact me if you have any questions, concerns. The only island I haven't been able to visit is Ni'ihau, but that's because it is privately owned, and in general, it is a closed off, closely knit community. So to be respectful of the residents, just to kind of put that out there for people.
And I just want to note for anyone who doesn't know, I mentioned that Jikoen Honganji in Honolulu was the only Buddhist temple that was still open during the war on Oahu or in Honolulu. And there's a great story behind it where the Reverend got taken away, but the family that was the caretaker, Lily Horio and her father, went to talk to General Emmons, who was in charge, and convinced him to let them reopen Jikoen as a support for the community. And, I think 11-year-old Lily was using what she learned in school to help her father argue that religion has nothing to do with patriotism, and that they convinced him. And I think it's such an incredible story.
Yeah, Hawaii is filled with all these weird stories, these anomalies that come up, which are really, truly kind of extraordinary. So going back to that whole story of Mitsumio Totori, what he actually did was conduct services not just to honor Buddhist soldiers who died in the war itself, but essentially Christian and other affiliations. And I asked the family, I said, "Well, how did you get the names?" Because there is, literally the sutras that are still written even till today. And they said, "I think my father read the newspaper, so he just did this out of compassion for these families and these individuals." So technically,
So he was
probably
doing it for the 100th and 442,
correct.
the ones who died in war. He was
And
conducting services for the family, yeah?
correct, because Hawaii had this weird thing of, because there was martial law, so there was still newspapers, but it was heavily censored. There'd be kind of a daily, if not weekly, report of all the casualties of war or those who were missing in action. So Totori, for example, Haleiwa Honganji was still, Shingon Mission was actually closed, but he was conducting services, and it was well known throughout the community. So you do see actually community members across the island chain, not just Hawaii, not just Oahu, but from other neighbor islands, reaching out to this individual to ask him to conduct prayer or memorial services for their loved ones. So,
And that's the thing that we said is such a different experience in Hawaii, is that because majority or all of the temples were closed, priests were taken away, you have people dying, especially overseas in war, and you don't have that closure. You don't have that, um, uh, even the opportunity to have a funeral or something to say goodbye, right?
well, this is where it's kind of this unusual problem that would highlight the strangeness and inequality of the male incarceration experience. The so-called joke, but it wasn't a joke. They said, well, if you're going to die in the incarceration center, you're so lucky because you're going to be having you're surrounded by dozens of Buddhist priests and, of every denomination. And, you see these elaborate funeral photographs, to be perfectly honest. So you had, this memorialization that did occur in the incarceration centers on the mainland. However, here in Hawaii, we had the opposite. We had the lack thereof, the lack of closure, the lack of honoring the memory of those who were killed in action, missing in action. And I think that really weighed heavily on people's families when you don't have that particular closure. So it's just kind of this weird comparison or contrast that was created by the exigencies of war, where you have an overabundance of religious leaders and you have a lack thereof.
And I would say that the experiences are just completely different. It's not a comparison. It's not a contest in any way of of horrificness or whatever. But I think that, I do appreciate that you are working hard to tell the story. I do also want to mention that Gail Okawa has recently come out with a book talking about her grandfather's experience being taken away and put into a Department of Justice camp, which is a great read. And it's out through UH Press, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, this is where we're seeing, it's kind of an evolution of incarceration and internment memoirs, where we do see essentially, of course, those who are incarcerated publishing their memoirs or their accounts, which were often republished or at least first published in the Japanese language newspapers after the war, coming out. Then we see the next evolution, which is essentially these family members recalling and understanding their experiences. And it's kind of a catharsis. So Gail Okawa does a very nice understanding about, how this impacted her family, her community, herself, and her identity. And she later traces it to Santa Fe and saying, she has this connection weirdly to this community that she would never think to, but because of her grandfather's experience, it drives home this community connection. So these communities are now connected in this weird way that I don't think, can be easily understood unless you really kind of understand the overall holistic experience of people.
So we have a couple minutes left. Is there any final thoughts that you want to share while you have a captive audience?
Oh no. So again, I'm still very much interested in the incarceration of certain individuals. Yes, and the experiences of, in particular, women, Okinawan Americans, to see if their experience was kind of unique or different. Neighbor island accounts, in particular, were really missing Molokai. It really would help. Any photographs from the other neighbor islands would also be appreciated, because we want to see visual evidence of what these sites look like. So we showed this video. I don't know if people are going to like it or think it's a roller coaster, because clearly it moves, but just to kind of experience it, to kind of see the visual evidence of what these incarceration sites were. They were very different, as you can tell, from the mainland incarceration centers, but just to kind of give insight to experiencing just a little bit of what it meant to be incarcerated, especially because these experiences were so individualized.
And definitely read Soga's book to get a sense of what this individual was feeling when he was picked up on December 7th and taken to Sand Island, and then all over to many different camps,
Yep. And if you are from the Big Island, Heidi Kim also published an account about the George Hoshida story. So George Hoshida was an artist. So you'll also see potentially drawings of your relatives in there. So he was a very prolific artist. But that's what we really need, more diversity beyond the Oahu-centric account, and more kind of family histories for people to come out and understand that their experience wasn't unique, and it is something that deserves to be told and to be understood.
And people need to go through their family albums to look at the background
Yes,
images,
look at your back.
to find any structures that Kelli might need.
Right. I mean, it's, again, how we understood what Kaunakakai jail looked like, the courthouse, is Armistice Day 1918, and it was, wait, what is that? And it's clearly a picture of a parade, but what we're looking at are images from behind, from these people, and it really is on people's personal family albums. So my last historical plug, this weekend, please make sure that you if you have any family photos, get your grandparents, your mothers, your fathers, and write the identity of who these people are, approximately when the date is, where they are, because later people will not know and they will dump the photographs.
Yes. So thank you so much for sharing your mana'o, your knowledge with us, and I really appreciate what you do.
Well, thank you for allowing me to just to kind of share my crazy history. As you can see in the back, all my crazy research. I feel like I'm a hoarder, but in a hopefully an organized way. But that's what they all say. So thank you so much, very much, everyone. And feel free to contact me with any questions, concerns. Mahalo.
Aloha.